Alright, let's see who the fuck gets in here first. I think you guys know the secret to get there now. It's fucking hilarious. Alright, here you go. Link in the chat. I'll see you guys there. Test, test, test. 1, 2. Test, 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 test. 1, 2. And make sure you guys mute yourself on Zoom because I don't want to hear fucking cars going by. All right. Oh shit. So I think we officially have a new champion in terms of getting to YouTube first. Hannah, good job. All right, so I just want to really quickly go over the idea of synthesizers, right? When you think about a synthesizer, a lot of you think about that sound of a synthesizer, right? If I go to my sounds and go under synths, right, you affiliate all these sounds with the word synthesizer, right? Now, technically, when you talk about a synthesizer, you're talking about synthesizing or creating a sound from whatever it may be, right? And the cool thing about synthesizers that have grown over popularity over the last like 20, 30, 40 years is that the magnitude or the amount of sounds that you can create with synthesizers is infinite. All right, because you have to think about before the idea of synthesizers, before the idea of electronic music, we had acoustic music. So we had like guitars. And even though we had electric guitars with distortion pedals and things like that, it was still limited within the confines of what a guitar could do or what the body of a guitar could produce in terms of sound. Same thing with vocals, right? Probably one of the oldest instruments being vocals. Drums. Drum sounds are restricted to the type of skin, the shell, right? The tightness, the tuning, the sticks you use, mallets, brushes, right? All these things had these certain ceilings that they would eventually hit, right? Even though that ceiling was really high and you could get so many crazy cool sounds with instruments throughout the ages, right? But when synthesizers kicked in, it just broke that glass ceiling in like an extraordinary way. The amount of flexibility and sounds that you can create from a synthesizer is absolutely ridiculous. And that's why there's no reason to say that, oh, I can't make my own unique sound. It's bullshit, because you absolutely can, right? Now, that being said, because there's an infinite number of sounds that you can create, it can get really, really complicated and confusing as to like, how do these things even work and where do I even start? If I don't even understand what a synthesizer is, where would I actually start? That's what I kind of want to go over now, because again, most of you guys are using synthesizers, but you might not be knowing how a basic functioning synthesizer works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go to a MIDI track, and then I'm going to go to my instruments, and in Ableton there is an instrument called analog, which is technically a very, very basic synthesizer, right? It's not pretty looking, it's not sexy and flashy, but it explains the process, and I just want to explain the process of synthesis through this, all right? And once you understand that, then when you open up any of your other fancy synthesizers, things will make a lot more sense. So, first thing that you have to understand is that this synthesizer is broken up into primarily 3 sections, but overall can be divided into about 8 sections, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, 9 sections. It's also a synthesizer that contains 2 different pathways for sound to be generated. So I'm only going to talk about one of them. It's technically 2, but they work in parallel and they do the exact same thing. So just for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to talk about the one side of the synthesizer. It'll make more sense when I get into it. So, at the very top, you see these things called OSC1 FIL1, and AMP1, right? These are the fundamental building blocks of any synthesizer, right? When you think about a synthesizer, that's what you're going to be talking about. You're going to be talking about an oscillator, which is the first one. You're going to be talking about a filter, which is the second one. And then you're going to talk about an amplifier. Those are the three building blocks of a synthesizer. Now, on top of that, you also have something called an LFO, which I'm going to get into a little later. But the three primary components of any synthesizer are those three: oscillator, filter, amplifier. By the way, if you're already on YouTube, you don't have to come back into the chat. So I'm not going to let you into Zoom because that's kind of redundant and a waste of time. But I'll let you back in when we come back to Zoom, don't worry. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the oscillator. The oscillator is the part of the synthesizer that generates the actual fundamental sound, right? So what is, if you think about all the way back to like what I was saying before about the different instruments that we have and the variety of sounds that we get, we talked about this a little bit in the beginning, and you might have already talked about it in Mod 1. But when you think about sound, when you think about my voice, when you think about a guitar playing, when you think about piano playing, what's happening is it's a bunch of different waves combining together to create a sound, a type of sound, right? Why is it that middle C on a piano sounds different from middle C on a guitar? It's the same note, the same frequency, but what's happening? There's a bunch of other frequencies and waves adding together based on the structure of the piano and the guitar, based on the materials that are being used, and even based on the way it's played. And that causes them to sound like two unique different instruments, right? So fundamentally, you can say that the pitch is the same and the waves that are being generated have a similar pattern, a similar frequency. But because of the overtones and the harmonics that are going on and the structures of the actual instruments, they sound completely different. You could even break it down even further. Like, why is it that middle C on a Gibson guitar sounds different from middle C on a Martin guitar, sounds different from middle C on a Taylor guitar, right? They're all guitars, right? It's all middle C, yet they do sound unique. Why do people buy 15 different kick drums? Why do you guys buy sample packs, right? It's because every sound has a unique quality to it. And what's happening is there are different waves adding and adding together to create that unique sound, right? It's not just one thing. It's a bunch of different waves adding together, and that's why we call it a complex wave. It's a combination of a bunch of different waves. So, oh my God, I was gonna be first. My Mac crashed. That's funny. So when we talk about a fundamental basic synthesizer, the oscillator usually creates the fundamental sounds that we deal with. And what are those fundamental sounds? We've already talked about them before. Sine wave, rectangle wave or square wave, triangle wave or sawtooth wave, and then noise, just general noise. So if you go into this oscillator section over here, you see where it says shape. If you click on that, you see that you have a few shapes to choose from. This one has sine wave, sawtooth, and square wave, right? It also has noise, which is just random. So let me just choose one. This is the sine wave. So if I just play a note, that is a sine wave playing middle C. Right? Now, if I change the type of fundamental sound that the oscillator generates from a sine wave to a sawtooth wave, right? Clearly there's a difference. It's way sharper, right? There's a lot of overtones happening that you can actually distinctly hear. What about a square wave? A little different, right? Still, you get some of those harmonics in there, maybe even a little harsher. And then finally, noise, which you guys should already know. It's random frequencies, right? But you have sine, sawtooth, and square wave. And you can already tell that they have different characteristics. Sawtooth and square wave are pretty close, but they are different. You can hear it. So that's the oscillator. The oscillator generates the fundamental sound wave. In this case, I'm just going to choose a square wave because I like square waves. Right? Now, you also have a little input gain knob over here. So if I turn this up and down, the volume feeding into the oscillator will change. Or rather, the volume of the oscillator will change. All right. Then you have a little F1/F2 underneath it. This is because, like I said, this synthesizer is made up of two components acting in parallel. You see that there's OSC1, oscillator 1 on top, and then oscillator 2 at the bottom. But I'm ignoring the bottom just for simplicity's sake. But all this is saying is that this oscillator is feeding completely into F1, which is the filter 1. I'm just going to keep it at that for now. In the oscillator section, you can also choose the octave and transposition of your note. That sounds good. Right? That's octaves, semitones, and then cents. Right? So you've got 3 ways to manipulate pitch. It's pretty cool. Then what you have at the bottom here is technically called an envelope. Now, we already talked about envelopes a bunch of times, but whenever you have a set of rules or parameters that need to be encompassing a sound, we call it an envelope. So you almost think about putting the sound within the confines of an envelope, literally, right? Now, this specifically is called a pitch envelope. And the reason why it's called a pitch envelope, and the reason why it's straight is because when I press the key, you hear one pitch, right? Doesn't change. What I can do, though, is if I modify the start note, or the start pitch, I can say, hey, I want the note to start at a higher pitch and gradually come down to the center pitch. The center pitch being the actual pitch that I'm playing, C3. Right? Same thing from low to up. Now you can also control how fast the change from that original pitch is to the center pitch. So for example, if I change this, it'll take longer to get to the center pitch. Whereas if I do it shorter, or if I do this, right? You can hear it doing like a start and then to the center. Right? Pretty cool. So that is the pitch envelope, right? I'm going to get more into envelopes a little later when we start to do amplifiers, because that's when it'll make way more sense. But there you go. You've got a little sawtooth. You choose your pitch. You can choose a pitch envelope type of fundamental sound. And then you can choose which filter it gets fed into. You can choose the F1 filter, the F2 filter, or a blend of both of them, right? A 50-50 blend if you wanted to. Now, I don't want to do that right now. What I do want to do is just go straight to F1. So an oscillator produces the sound, and that gets fed into a filter, right? So the filter is basically an equalizer, right? If you look at this little pull-down menu over here, it says LP24, which is basically low pass 24 dB per octave, right? Now, you can have a bunch of different options like notches or band passes or high passes, but the low pass is the most popular one and the most common one. And when you have chosen what type of filter you're feeding into, you can then choose where the cutoff is for that filter. So just to kind of recap, if I go into my audio effects and just pull out an EQ, right? So this, what I'm showing you right now, this number 8 is a low pass filter, right? Because as I decrease the frequency, it allows the lower frequencies to pass, and it cuts off all the high frequencies. You guys know this already, right? So watch this. Right? So depending on the frequency that I choose, right, over here, more and more low end is allowed to pass through and more high end is cut off. So this frequency, when it's in the context of a low pass filter, is called the cut off frequency, because that's the frequency where cut off starts to begin. Cut off begins, right? Now, another thing that you need to know, besides the cutoff value, is that at the actual point of cutoff, you can boost that point, right? So check this out. So suppose I'm cutting off at 2.5 kilohertz. I can also raise it at 2.5, and you can hear the resonance that happens with that. Or you can hear the harmonic or the overtone that happens. It gets accentuated, right? That is technically what we call resonance on a synthesizer. So if you go back to your synthesizer, you've chosen a low pass filter. This frequency refers to the cutoff frequency. So if I change this, right, it's doing the same thing. It's cutting off the high frequencies. Right? And if I set it to 2.5, everything below 2.5 passes, everything above starts to get quieter. But then if I turn this knob called the reso knob or the resonance knob, you'll hear that at 2.5, we'll start to hear some gain. Right? Right? So I know this all sounds really boring and fundamental, but this is the actual basis for all the synthesizers that you guys use. It's pretty wild. Next, we have the filter feeding into the amplifier section over here. Now in the amplifier section, obviously, any sound that got generated and messed with by a filter needs to be amplified and heard. And that's what the amplifier is for. You have a level section, right? To turn up and down. You also have a pan to turn left and right. Left, right. Okay? Now this is where I want to start to get into the idea of... Josh, I don't know why you're trying to get in, dude. If you're on YouTube, you're fine. All right. This is where I want to try to get into the idea of the envelope, right? And I wanted to talk about it specifically in terms of amplitude, because that's the way you'll understand it the most. So when you're in your amplifier section, you see that there's a little set of lines over here, right? This is technically what we call the amplifier envelope, right? The amplitude envelope, really. So if you think about a graph, x-axis and y-axis, right? The y-axis upwards is amplitude. X-axis is always time, right? So what can you tell from this? Well, if this is the shape of the sound in terms of amplitude and time, what this is basically saying is that as soon as I hit the key, the note immediately reaches the highest amplitude value, right? So it reaches that initial hit first, as soon as I hit the key, right? Then, after a couple of seconds or milliseconds, it comes down to a different level over here, this straight line, right? So hit the key, it straight away goes to the highest value, and then it decreases to a more sustained value. And then when you let go, it takes a while for the amplitude to go to 0. So attack, decay, sustain, release. Those are the 4 terms that we use to define the shape of a sound, right? And in this context, we're using it for amplitude. So what would happen if I, say, drag this guy a little bit to the right? What does that mean? That means when I press the key, it takes a bit of time for it to reach its maximum volume. Then it comes down to its sustain volume, right? So check it out. Right? It took a while. So that means that this has a slower attack. Whereas if I put it right up there, way more pointy. It has that kind of fast attack, transient nature. ADSR, exactly. So I could have a slow attack to make something build up. I could have a long or short decay until it reaches its sustain level. Now, sustain level means if you press and hold the key, what's the level that the sound eventually remains at, right? I don't know if you heard that little duck, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the sustain level way down, and you're going to watch it go all the way up and then go back down. I'm still holding the key, so this is the sustain level, right? It's way lower than the highest level over here. So slow attack, slow decay, low sustain, and then when I let go, it takes a couple of milliseconds for it to die out to 0. So that means if I extended my release to say something longer, we'd have a slow attack, slow decay, low sustain level, and then I let go and it dies out, right? You might have noticed that as I was changing these different shapes, these parameters were changing too, right? So if I change attack, you see that the attack over there changes, decay over there, sustain, and then of course release, right? So that's the fundamental nature of the ADSR envelope. So you can actually create some interesting sounds. So now maybe I want something with a fast attack and a very fast release. So as soon as I let go, it's cut off. So it's super sharp. Whereas I could have something with a fast attack and a long release. So fast attack, but takes a while to die out. Anyway, these are like the basic tools that you use to actually shape the sounds in the way you want them, right? And the other cool thing is that you can change between linear and exponential for the decay and the release. It's pretty cool. And the attack, actually. Yeah, thought so. Attack, decay, and release. So if you're not happy with like a linear sound, you can have it more exponential, like curved. Right? It's interesting. You get all these different textures and shapes just by messing around with the ADSR curve, which is why a lot of people love to mess around with it. And this is the ADSR curve applied onto the amplitude. You may or may not have noticed, but there was an ADSR curve that you can apply on the frequency too, right? So just as a quick example, check this out. Right? So it took a couple of seconds to reach its maximum frequency value before coming back down the decay to a sustained frequency value. And then when I let go, it takes time to die out as well. So it's really interesting what you can do with ADSR curves. At least I think it's interesting. Right? So there you go. Those are the three fundamental building blocks of a synthesizer. Oscillator to generate the actual sound, whether it's a sine wave, square wave, sawtooth wave. Filter to modify the frequency of the sound and the tone of the sound. And then amplitude or amplifier to amplify the actual sound. Right? This applies to analog synthesizers too. So if anybody owns any analog synthesizers, sounds like the Matrix. Oh, dude, I can't remember. Does anybody remember I know it's like a minor sixth chord, right? Right? Isn't this something like that? Dude, fucking favorite movie of all time. Yeah, curious what they do with this next one. All right. So now to move on to, I'm just going to set the ADSR curve back to a regular one. Oh, I guess I didn't do this. All right, so now we move on to the next component of a synthesizer, which is personally my favorite, which is the LFO, right? LFO stands for Low Frequency Oscillator. So you might be wondering, well, we already have an oscillator here. Why do we have another one over here, which is just for low frequencies? Well, here's the deal. This first oscillator produces the sound that you're going to then manipulate and convert into something that sounds more unique, right? Using the filter and the amplifier and the ADSR curves. This LFO, this low frequency oscillator, isn't going to be heard technically. Rather, you're going to map a parameter to the LFO so that it automates that parameter based on the signal it generates. I know that's like kind of a mind fuck, but just let me break this down. So an LFO, low frequency oscillator. We already know that oscillators are devices that produce sound. So low frequency oscillator means that it's going to produce a low frequency sound, right? And you can see from here that you can choose from sine wave, triangle, rectangle, or random noises, right? Now here's the thing. When you think about a sine wave, you think about that curve going up and down, up and down, up and down. What if you could map your volume to go up and down, up and down, up and down without you having to touch it all the time? So for example, what if I wanted to do, say, let's do level, right? So what if I wanted to do this? Right? I want that to be part of my sound. I want it to have like a movement to it. Well, is there a way that I can do that without having to manually turn it up and down? You might be thinking, oh, I'll just automate it in Ableton. Why not? And you'd be right for doing that, but there's something built into a synthesizer that lets you do that without having to do it on your own, and you can map it to your tempo. So you can automate your synthesizer. Exactly, you got it. That's exactly it, Ty. Right? So check this out. LFO, and just for the purposes, I'm going to set it to just a random, I'm going to have it generate 700 hertz, right? Totally random. But now I'm going to go to my amplifier section, and here where it says level mod or level modulation. Modulation just means change, really. You can say turn up the LFO information or the LFO input so that the volume is now following this 700 hertz sine wave. So check it out. What happens when I play now? Right? I'm just holding that down. depending on how high I put this LFO input, you got between -1 and 1, it determines how big of a discrepancy there is between the highest and lowest points of the sine wave, and thus the highest and lowest points of your level. So if I choose a lower value, like say 0.3, you'll hear less of an up and down movement. But you can still hear it, right? If I turn it all the way up to 1, you hear all the way from silence to max volume. Right? So you can create waves that have like a motion to them. And what's even cooler is that you can map it to the project tempo. This is why I love Ableton. So over here where it says LFO, your standard selection for what the LFO is, like what value the LFO is in frequency or hertz. But you can change that to be notation or quarter notes, eighth notes. So that means based on your tempo, if we can hear some metronome, please. Check this out. I wish I played it on time, but you get the idea, right? Let's do eighth notes. Right? I think there's a latency, so I had to hit it early. But you get the idea, right? It's going based on eighth notes. I can do 16th notes too. And you know what? Maybe I'll do rectangle. Rectangle is just up and down. There's no kind of smooth movement, right? With a sine wave, you get the up and the down, the gradual up and down, right? But with a rectangle, you get way more harder, defined values. Right? Pretty fucking cool. Look, you can do this for a bunch of different parameters as well. But before I get into that, so you can choose your rate, you can choose the type of LFO signal you get, and you can choose how wide or narrow the actual wave is. Well, in the case of rectangle. I think that's pretty fucking cool. And again, sine wave is just way smoother. Like you can hear the sine wave go up and down. Right, you hear all the values in between. Triangle's a little different. And rectangle is like on off. Right? So this is the beauty of LFOs. So we just did volume. Let's do something else. You see that there's level modulation over here, but right here you have pan modulation, which should obviously imply what you're thinking. If I turn this all the way up to 1, what's going to happen? Wait. Yeah, that. Right? And you can change the rate. And you can add volume to it. It's pretty fucking crazy, I think. Right? So that's where LFOs can be used to automate different parameters. Let's do something else. So we did pan, we did level. How about we do pitch? So pitch mod maps to LFO 1. If I turn this up, going to happen. Let's do sine wave because it's going to be way more clear. I don't think you're going to be able to tell. Here we go. So the lower the LFO input value, the smaller the variations in the actual movement. The higher, the more drastic the changes, right? Right? So all I did there was I changed the pulse width, which is when you think about a square wave, it has a defined width, right? And then you can have the LFO change the width in real time based on the LFO setting. It's pretty wild. Also, another thing that I forgot to mention is that in your oscillator section, you can add an automatic sub octave below any pitch that you have. So, right, if you have this and I turn up the level of the sub, you have an automatic sub frequency underneath. Oh, that's the fucking Stranger Things thing. Oh shit, we gotta do it now. So you guys remember how to do that? Go to your MIDI effects, go to Arpeggiator, and then make sure it's up, down. That's what we want. And then make sure it's like 16th notes, right? And then you can start messing around with frequencies. This is how they do it. Maybe we'll choose. I don't know if it's fucking with you, but the pan is on right now. You can also have the frequency change. And the res change. Although I like to change that shit manually. But there you go. That's literally... Oh, is it minor? Are you sure? I think that was it. I think it's like a major with a seventh. I don't know. Somebody confirmed that for me because yeah, I can't even remember. Maybe it is minor. But there you go. That's how they do it. They literally, like, if you just take a quick example of using the arpeggiator, you can literally just do it. So you have your MIDI notes that are just going to go loop over and over again, right? But then within the context of your instrument, that fucking sub. Anyway, so yeah, people just played that, put it through an arpeggiator. Oh, it's E minor. Really? All right, well, you guys get the idea. You get the idea. I trust your judgment on it. But yeah, there you go. That's the cool thing about oscillators, is that you can just fuck around with all these things and map certain parameters to an LFO. So like for frequency, like when I turned up the LFO, listen to what it did. You hear the frequency kind of build up, right? You can change the res too. Right, so that's where the resonance frequency starts to boost up more and more and more. It's mapping to that LFO sine movement going up and down and up and down. Your frequency is going up and down and up and down. Or your reso is going up and down and up and down. But this is where you can create all these kinds of unique sounds. And that's just the half of it, because think about it. This is just the top half of the oscillator, right? We still have a bottom half to deal with too. And in the bottom half, you can add another oscillator with a new sound. Let's say sawtooth. Maybe we'll do like an octave above, and we'll reduce the volume of it, right? Have that go into the filter F2 over here. Have that go into the amplifier over here. So now you hear a different wave playing at the same time. Oh man, you can get all kinds of crazy. And then you have two oscillators feeding into two separate filters, feeding into two separate amplifiers. Then you can have both of them mapped to two separate LFOs. So one of the LFOs can be going at the half note. The other one can be going at the 16th note. And maybe this can be mapped to, this LFO can be mapped to, say, let's make it a square wave and let's map it to level. Oh, it's already 30. Yeah. Well, let's take it off Arpeggiator for a second, but you get the idea. So I have one LFO changing the volume. I have two oscillators. One's a square wave, producing a square wave. One's a rectangle. Sorry, one's a square, one's a triangle. Going to two separate filters, two separate amplifiers. One of them has an LFO that's mapped to frequency, playing at a half note rate. The other one has level mapped onto a 32nd note LFO mapped to a, which is producing a square wave. So you can get fucking ridiculous. Right? It's fucking crazy what you can do with this shit, man. Yeah, so this is like the fundamental, basic breakdown of what a synthesizer does. I think there's a second major theme, but the main one is E minor. Okay, so I guess Ty and Hannah have found out that it's E minor. Do you know the notes? Whatever. I can't play it. I can't play it with one hand, but you get the idea. All right. And then obviously at the very end, you have a gain section for your volume and an overall tuning section and vibrato section, which is kind of cool. So check this out. Right. Right. So you have like these cool little master knob features as well. One of them is a vibrato. The other one is for you can hear it. You can hear it vary the pitch up and down, right? And the other one, I think this one, it says that it sets, what does it say? Sets the speed of the glide between the two notes. That might be for a specific setting. I might need to find out what that is. But you do have a master volume and a master section, which controls both of the outputs or modifies both of the outputs. So that is your fundamental synthesizer, and the assignment is just to play around with this and just come up with an interesting sound that's unique. Again, if you can make an interesting sound with just these basic fundamental waveforms, you can understand how to work all these crazy big synthesizers later on. And the cool thing, even though you have two oscillators going in parallel, you can also add a bit of noise as well. Right, so I don't know if you hear that, but this is noise. It's just pure noise. Right, and you can combine that with your oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. It's pretty dope. Pretty dope. E minor, right. So I'm going to see if I actually have... Right, so, okay. So this is a synthesizer by Slate, right? And you might, if you ever find yourself playing with these synthesizers, you might be completely intimidated by the fact that, oh my God, there's just too much. But if you understand that basic one that I showed you, most of the components are exactly the same. So you have filters, filter envelope, amplitude envelope, modulation envelope, right? You have your actual wavetable for sound, and I'm not going to get into the sampler, but you get the idea. Rezo. You get some wild shit from this. Obviously, they have a bunch of presets too that you can choose from, but it's all based on the fundamental idea of a synthesizer, right? All these sounds are created from that. So if you're into sound design and shit, man, synthesizers are your thing, right? Really, really cool what you can do with this stuff. You guys are probably used to your 808s and everything, and which is why, you know, you've probably already fulfilled that. But yeah, that is your basic synthesizer lesson. Pretty wild, right? Again, this one, it's called Analog. It's available in Ableton Standard and the Pro version, or Suite version, sorry. And it's 2 oscillators into 2 filters into 2 amplifiers with 2 separate LFOs. Chappelle Show Walker. Hey, I think Chappelle's coming out with a new stand-up, by the way. I saw somebody say something. But there you go. That's synthesizers for you. Yeah, let me stop at that because that was quite a bit. Let's take it back to Zoom.